As Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces, General Dwight Eisenhower had under his command the top military men in both Great Britain and the United States to assist him in working out the enormously complex plans for the long-awaited invasion across the Channel. For generations, the Ruhr had been mined alternately by Germany and France, as control of the key territory shifted from one country to the other during the succession of Franco-Prussian wars. Each year, millions of tons of coal were mined in the Ruhr and fed into the maw of Germany's heavy war industry. Without the Ruhr's enormous output of coal, the German war machine could not have functioned efficiently. The huge quantities of materiel which had made Hitler's victories in Europe and Africa possible had their origin in the Ruhr. Now, as Hitler's grip on Western Europe was threatened by the Allies, Nazi war machines continued to pour in a steady stream from German factories, whose operation depended largely on the Ruhr. To prepare for the expected invasion, the Nazis began, early in 1944, to strengthen their Atlantic Wall. Its concrete and steel defenses dominated the beaches along the north coast of France. To German high commanders like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox of North Africa, the Atlantic Wall seemed solid enough to withstand any Allied assault. The Nazi heavy coastal guns and the fortifications themselves were heavily camouflaged in an effort to fool any Allied inspection from the sea or air. On shore, the Nazis felt they were invincible. At sea, in the waters off the French coast, the Germans planted a profusion of mines to block the advance of Allied warships and transports. In the early months of 1944, nearly 1 million Allied soldiers arrived in the United Kingdom, swelling the potential striking force of Allied fighting men there to almost 3 million. The strength of the Allied air forces in the British Isles had grown from a few thousand planes in early 1942 to more than 15,000 planes of all types. The 5,000 Allied bombers in England were prepared to drop hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs in support of the invasion. The stockpile of vehicles alone for use in the invasion totaled hundreds of thousands of tons. Every available foot of space on overcrowded Britain was used for storage. Landing craft of all types were in readiness for the assault on the beaches. All over the British Isles, experiments were being conducted with devices only recently developed for combating the German war machine. The men who were to make the greatest assault in history trained exhaustively under conditions similar to those they would probably meet on the continent. The pre-invasion exercises were much tougher than the maneuvers they had known in the U.S., and the men took them much more seriously. The troops gained needed experience in coordinating their simulated attack with that of other units and operating as a well-integrated fighting force. Weapons like the bazooka, used for the first time in World War II, were carefully tested. And the men themselves were toughened up for the invasion in extensive sessions of hand-to-hand fighting. All our preparations were inspected in detail by the highest Allied officials. The paratroopers had been trained to peak condition. Both mentally and physically, they were fit and ready to lead the assault on the enemy in France. Prime Minister Churchill and General Eisenhower were impressed with the performance of the paratroopers. The airborne force to be used in the invasion was the greatest up to that time. More than 13,000 men were to participate in the drop behind the enemy's lines. The heavy air blows against the railroads in France began in April, about 2 months before the tentative invasion date. The bombing attacks against French rail centers were the first step in the disruption of the Nazis' communication system in France. Of course, our bombers did not always escape unscathed. The flyers realized that these military objectives in France must be intensively bombed, in spite of the considerable risks to our own air crews and planes. During the weeks before D-Day, General Eisenhower devoted as much of his time as possible to visiting the troops who were to participate in the attack on the Nazis' fortress of Europe. The men prepared to go aboard ship. Some of the last-minute haircuts were a little on the close-cropped side. Many of the men had fathers who served in France in World War I, but never got any farther with the French language than Mademoiselle from Armentières. Their foresighted sons in World War II were intent on being a little better equipped for those leaves in Paris. Within a week, the troops would be storming the invasion beaches in the greatest military attack in all history. But with final preparations completed, there was time for a few days of relaxation. Finally, during the last days of May 1944, the all-important materiel was moved to the ships. The men were to assemble by the numbers of their ships, and all light vehicles and equipment which were to accompany the assault forces in their ships was to be identified in the same manner to avoid any possibility of a mix-up. On June 1st and 2nd, The troops left their camps and headed directly for the ports of embarkation under the strict surveillance of the military police. With D-Day set for June 5th, the weather turned suddenly bad the day before the scheduled assault. However, as the weather cleared, the decision was made to go ahead with the attack on June 6th. First striking forces in the most momentous assault of all time were the paratroopers, scheduled to drop behind the enemy's lines. The 175,000 men who made up the air and ground forces for the cross-channel attack arrived at the various ports of embarkation on the English coast by June 3rd, under heavy guard. The thousands of ships and small craft which comprised the invasion fleet were waiting in readiness to take aboard their human cargo. More than 4,000 ships and small craft were to ferry across the channel the men who were to land on the French coast on D-Day itself. To facilitate the advance of the troops once the invasion was launched, thousands of vehicles were loaded aboard the same ships which were to transport the men. On the days directly preceding D-Day, the southern coasts of England were alive with activity. The Allied invasion forces were bracing themselves for the mighty effort which at that moment was looked upon by many as the greatest military gamble in history. In spite of the vastness of the force of men and equipment involved in the attack, preparations for the departure of the assault units were conducted smoothly and efficiently. The last of the ships which were to participate in the D-Day assault were loaded to capacity, and the time for departure from the English coast was finally at hand. In the late afternoon of June 5th, D-Day -1, all preparations finally ended. The invasion fleet moved into the channel and made ready to assume the intricate pattern of positions from which, the following morning, the invasion of the French coast of the Nazis' European fortress would be launched. The moment all the world was tensely awaiting was now only hours away. The plan was for 3 Allied airborne divisions to land behind the beaches to cut Nazi communications and disorganize the enemy. Then, some 5 hours later, the first Allied invasion troops were to storm ashore on a 50-mile stretch of the French coast bordering the English Channel. D-Day finally dawned. The weather was favorable. The attack on the French coast was stepped up.
The air plan, already in execution, called for the progressive wearing down of the Luftwaffe and the destruction of critical points in the rail and highway systems, so as to isolate the coastal areas selected for assault. For D-Day, the air forces were charged with the responsibility of demolishing selected targets in the enemy's coastal defenses, of providing overhead cover, and rendering general fighter-bomber support.
The Nazi planes that got off the ground didn't get very far. The area got just as thorough a going over as an important German industrial region. Allied pilots gave it the A treatment. In England, early on D-Day, gliders which were to carry GIs to reinforce the paratroopers were prepared for the takeoff. The first group of 51 gliders carried about 150 men, plus anti-tank weapons, to be landed before the beaches were invaded. In the early morning of June 6th, the first group of gliders was pulled off the ground and towed out across the channel, to be cut loose over the area where the paratroopers had dropped earlier. The small fields in which they were forced to land caused serious losses. San Mary-Glis was the first town to be captured by American paratroopers early on D-Day morning. In addition to seizing key spots to facilitate the advance of the major forces, the airborne troops proved invaluable as scouts. One of their most important functions was the determination of enemy strength throughout the French coastal provinces. Meanwhile, in the rough waters of the Channel, the giant invasion fleet was proceeding carefully toward the French coast, carrying the greatest amphibious force in history. Virtually every type of Allied assault vessel was pressed into use for the operation. The invasion armada had a complement of 4,100 ships and small craft, and carried 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles and weapons, and tons of supplies. In spite of close quarters in the Channel, the vast invasion fleet made the crossing successfully, suffering the loss of not a single vessel by German action. With all in readiness and H-hour drawing close, the men rededicated their efforts. The GIs and the Navy gun crews waited expectantly for an enemy air attack, but strangely, there was none. One of the most important and dirtiest of preparatory jobs was done by the minesweepers, which moved in and exploded mines just off the coast, clearing safe channels for the assault boats. Losses among the 200 minesweepers engaged in this hazardous mission were slight. The Germans, though surprised by our attack in relatively rough weather, were quick to contest the invasion. The coastal defenses, which they had spent years in preparing for this moment, were readied for action without delay. In the early morning hours just before H-hour, when Allied troops were scheduled to set foot on French soil, the showdown battle of Europe was begun. While the troops prepared to go ashore, the savage battle for domination of the beaches started. Allied warships trained their heavy guns on the German coastal defenses, which had not been knocked out by the Allied air bombardment. As usual, the destroyers, in closer to the beach, drew the enemy's fire. With their targets spotted, the warships went into action. While the battle raged on, the transports prepared to send their troops ashore. The men embarked calmly on the last leg of their trip. For some, this was their first time in action.
Prepare the cast off!
After the planes and the warships had done their jobs, The final outcome of the mighty battle depended largely on the infantrymen. The GIs and the landing boats were fully aware that they were the center of attention. Springing to the defense of their European fortress, the Germans prepared to mass their strength in the area of our landings for a heavy counterblow. Somehow they hadn't been expecting an Allied landing at that exact time. For the troops, this was it. The British and Canadians, forming the British Second Army, landed on the left flank of the assault against determined Nazi opposition. On the right flank, the American First Army troops stormed ashore under heavy enemy fire. Our victory in World War II hung in the balance. 3 American divisions poured ashore on Omaha and Utah beaches and fought desperately for a foothold. It looked like a tough battle ahead, with the issue very much in doubt. It was a tough battle, and American prospects for the immediate future were anything but bright. Casualties on D-Day were heavy, especially on Omaha Beach. 3,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, and missing on Omaha Beach alone on that first day. Along some of the beaches, landing conditions were highly unfavorable. Some of the landing boats were badly swamped, and the soldiers in them had a grueling time making the shore. They were in no condition at all to battle the Germans. Fortunately, the number of men who had to be pulled out of the rough sea was fairly small, and so the combat strength of their units was not seriously diminished. By D-Day afternoon, American artillery was ashore and in use. In the late afternoon of D-Day, some of the beaches were secured, and the troops began the drive inland to keep the enemy off balance. Every Allied advance was slowed down considerably by Nazi obstacles. The French coastal area had been liberally planted with mines, which the Nazis always believed in using plentifully. Our mine detection units reaped an abundant harvest in the country near the beaches. Although the offensive was hampered by the innumerable Nazi mines, the detection units cleared the areas quickly, enabling the troops to move forward without much delay. In their drive up the peninsula toward Cherbourg, the GIs of the First Army, all veterans now, hammered at the Nazis without let-up. There were no large-scale surrenders, but enough prisoners were taken to supply Allied intelligence officers with up-to-the-minute information about the enemy.
Medic.
During the first week's fighting, Allied casualties mounted with appalling swiftness to thousands of dead, wounded, and missing. Wreckage littered the landing areas, particularly at Omaha Beach, where rough seas and very heavy German fire resulted in the disabling of quantities of our landing craft. On June 7th, the day following the first landings, General Eisenhower, accompanied by his naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Ramsey, toured the assault area offshore by destroyer. The weather had improved considerably, thus making it possible for the Allies to follow up their initial success by quickly landing reinforcements and large quantities of materiel. With the historic Normandy landing successfully accomplished, the Allies took stock of their situation. On June 7th, D-Day +1, General Eisenhower and Admiral Ramsey, his naval commander-in-chief, inspected the landing beaches with an eye to the problem of landing the large additional forces needed for the big drive against Hitler's armies. As in every campaign in World War II, one of the first orders of business following the invasion was the quick construction of airfields from which to support the advance of the ground forces. Experienced construction units built new airfields on the continent as fast as they were called for. In each case, the strips were in use a miraculously short time after the men started work. The results of their efficiency were readily felt, especially by the enemy. Less than a week after the assault troops had stormed ashore on the Normandy beaches, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces was the host for a tour of inspection of the area by several unexpected visitors from Washington. All anti-aircraft crews in the area tried to hit them in flight with some success. Every means at hand was used to try to explode them before they landed. In Germany, construction was being rushed on newer, more devastating weapons. In the final stages of its experimental phase, the V-2 rocket bomb was being readied for use against England. In early tests, many V-2s turned out to be failures. But after 2 years of experimentation, the rockets were performing well enough for leading German engineers to persuade Hitler that their use in large numbers against England would achieve wholesale destruction. The first non-experimental launching was set for late summer. The capture of Cherbourg, a major port, was a matter of immediate importance. American GIs of the 7th Corps assigned to the job expected stiff resistance from the defending Nazi garrison. Before our big guns went into action to soften up the German positions, American Cub planes again proved invaluable in spotting enemy strongpoints. Once their positions were spotted, our attack got going without delay.
Fire!
Cherbourg itself was strongly defended, but by June 25th, the first American troops forced their way into the city after a vicious battle and paved the way for the final capture. But first, the GIs had a last remnant of the Nazi garrison to silence. GIs had to finish them off, one by one. Cherbourg finally fell on June 27th, just 3 weeks after D-Day. The area yielded some 39,000 Nazi prisoners, most of whom had fought stubbornly until confronted by American infantry patrols. These Nazis seemed surprised indeed to find themselves in Allied hands, and especially in such a short time. Their grandiose dreams of victory had never ended in such a humiliating spectacle. After several days, there were few reminders of the Nazi occupation. To the citizens of Cherbourg, life began again. The Nazis, in their customary fashion, had succeeded in pretty thoroughly wrecking Cherbourg. But the Allies now controlled a major port, which would enable them to deliver large quantities of supplies to the troops much more quickly. General Eisenhower was greatly pleased with the performance of the troops under Generals Bradley and Lieutenant Joe Collins on the western flank in the Battle of the Beachhead. In their first real test on French soil, they had come through in fine style. For weeks, the battle for Caen raged, but the Germans continued to hold on under Montgomery's heaviest assaults. After a month of steady bombing and shelling, Caen finally was taken by Montgomery's men on July 9th. The community, or what was left of it, was liberated at last, and the townsfolk no longer moved about in the shadow of the Nazi conqueror. The younger inhabitants, who had been children when the Nazis swept through France in 1940, were especially happy to be liberated. After the capture of Caen by the British, the advance of Allied forces on all fronts was slowed down. To offer a lift to morale, General Eisenhower personally decorated a number of GIs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The need for nourishing food and sufficient rest became matters of primary concern for even the most hardened combat soldiers. If they were to stay in good fighting trim, these needs had to be satisfied periodically, even though it meant that they would have to be pulled out of the lines in a tough campaign. Most effective morale builder for many GIs was a chance to renew their spiritual lives. To many GIs who had their faith to comfort them, even the prospect of death seemed easier to bear. Of course, there were moments which were not grim. In many of the liberated French towns and villages, the inhabitants were anxious to demonstrate their appreciation of deliverance from their Nazi conquerors. Meanwhile, a concentrated Allied attack was already overdue. The key point on the Allied offensive was the town of Saint-Lô, from which Allied commanders planned to break out in spite of strong enemy counteraction. The capture of Saint-Lô was a major step in breaking through the heavy layer of Nazi resistance. As expected, the Allies had a tough job on their hands.
progress on the first day was slow.
With the Germans fighting desperately to contain them, Bradley's forces continued their punishing attack. The Allies drove almost due south through Avranches. The First Army then turned eastward to hit the Germans' flank, but the enemy contested this action. The weight of the Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdeval, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 somewhat battered tank divisions into the battle, the Nazis continued their counteroffensive for 3 days. Their gains were tiny, a matter of only a few miles, but they fanatically carried on their attack in spite of equally determined opposition. They used every available weapon in their sustained attack on our tanks and troops. They matched us weapon for weapon. If the Germans succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the Allied position beyond that area would be grave. Successfully withstanding the brunt of the Nazi attack, the Allies now moved to encircle the forward Nazi units. This maneuver was to be accomplished by a double thrust, by the Canadian First Army toward Falaise and by the U.S. Third Army toward Argentan. Patton's Third Army split into 2 major groups, one section driving straight eastward from Laval and the other swinging around the Nazis' flank and driving north into the German position at Argentan. Caught in the giant pincers between Falaise and Argentan, the Germans suffered staggering casualties. Thousands killed and wounded in only a few days' fighting. Meanwhile, the Canadian drive into the Germans' flank from the north at Falaise met determined Nazi resistance. By driving south through Falaise, the Canadians planned to join forces with the Americans near Argentan and thus completely encircle the forward Nazi attacking units. If this operation was successful, the roads across France would be open to Allied use, and nothing could stop an all-out Allied chase of the disorganized enemy to the banks of the Rhine. The battle on the Germans' northern flank was one of the most concentrated actions in the campaign on the continent. Against desperate resistance, the Canadian First Army troops hit the enemy in a direct frontal assault. 3 days later, near the little town of Chambois, the pincers closed as the Canadian Army, which took Falaise, met the Americans who seized Argentan, and a large Nazi force was effectively trapped. Many of the Nazi prisoners were disarmed and searched by French patriots who volunteered eagerly for the job. Though a considerable number of German troops escaped eastward toward the River Seine, more than 100,000 Nazi soldiers were caught within the circle and taken prisoner by the Allies. For the Germans, the encirclement of thousands of their crack troops was supplemented by the loss of great quantities of invaluable materiel, which they could not immediately replace. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket ended according to plan. For weeks, the 8th Corps assaulted the Nazi defenses on the Brittany Peninsula before the enemy capitulated. The German garrison, what was left of it, surrendered after an exhausting siege. Some of the defenders had obviously fortified themselves with alcohol during the drawn-out battle and were most uncooperative about answering questions put to them by their captors. The goal of every Allied soldier, from private to general, who set foot on the soil of France in the summer of 1944, was Paris. For General Jacques Leclerc, commander of the French 2nd Division, which had fought brilliantly in the desert campaign in Africa against Rommel, this goal had a special meaning. The moment when the French capital would finally be freed drew excitingly close as the Allies rolled victoriously through the crowded streets of newly liberated French towns. This was the momentous day the townsfolk had dreamed about for 4 long years. For in June 1940, with the arrival of the Nazi troops, the gay city that was Paris had changed into a somber, spiritless German garrison town, which the Nazis planned to turn into a playground for the military. Everywhere there were German uniforms. The conquering Nazi soldiers who had marched into Paris in June were replaced by special occupation troops. And always there was a steady flow of German fighting men back from the fronts for liberty. The City of Light became a city of sorrow under the shadow of the swastika. From the day they occupied it, the Nazis fell to work on transforming the face of the city. Evidences of this metamorphosis on every side reminded doleful Parisians that their city was no longer theirs. As expected, the Nazis with their Gestapo ruled Paris with an iron hand. With the German military in complete control, the city became an armed camp and functioned in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust under the strict surveillance of the ubiquitous Nazi soldiery. Even traditional French ceremonies were conducted under the watchful eye of the conquerors. However, Parisians did succeed in keeping the torch burning at the tomb of their unknown soldier of World War I throughout the Nazi occupation. But the Nazi occupation forces did not supervise everything that went on in Paris and the surrounding country. From the outside world came the voices of freedom. Voices like General de Gaulle, urging his countrymen to remain firm in their trust in the final victory for France and its people. Loyal Frenchmen did not merely mark time during the occupation. Soon after the Germans imposed their rule, resistance groups sprang up all over the country. Seizure of ammunition had a high priority on the list of resistance activities aimed at undermining the Nazis at every opportunity. Demolition of rail lines had a crippling effect on Nazi movements of troops and equipment. A true picture of what was actually happening in France and in the free world outside was presented in the pages of resistance newspapers, published secretly and distributed to Frenchmen eager for a few words of hope. Hundreds of underground newspapers were published during the occupation under overwhelming handicaps. The Allies sometimes managed to drop supplies to those groups who were among the most active in the resistance. The Maquis, whose members hid in the hills to avoid being forced into Nazi labor gangs. With this badly needed equipment, the Maquisards operated as guerrillas and sometimes killed several hundred Nazi soldiers in surprise attacks. After D-Day on the Normandy beaches, the various Maquis groups were organized into the FFI, French Forces of the Interior, to assist Allied troops in the destruction of the enemy. In mid-August, with Allied armies only a few kilometers from Paris, the resistance opposition to the Nazis flared into open insurrection. The long-planned revolt began to take shape. All Parisians knew the Allies were not far off, and their mounting hate toward their Nazi rulers at last came fully out into the open. The National Resistance Council had planned thoroughly for the day of vengeance. They concluded their preparations coolly and waited for the right moment to strike. Finally, on August 19th, the resistance opened fire. Once started, the insurrection quickly gained momentum. The revolt was successful in one sense. Numbers of the enemy were killed, and German administrators in key civil posts were put to rout. The German grip on Paris was effectively loosened by the FFI. But many felt that the revolt was premature. It soon became apparent that the Parisians were not quite strong enough to win back their city completely without aid. General Leclerc's men entered Paris on August 24th and immediately restored the city officially to French authority. For 50 months, Parisians had waited for this moment when they could again breathe the air of freedom so long denied them. Overnight, Paris was once again gay and happy. The people's unshakable trust in the return of a free France had proved sound. Liberty, equality, fraternity was again the standard. But the French soldiers still had the enemy to contend with. General Leclerc's tank crews and American Shermans used their experience gained at Le Mans and Alençon to good advantage. Paris again became a battleground. Many of its most fashionable avenues were under constant enemy sniper fire. To assist the French 2nd Division, elements of the American 4th Division were sent in, and American and French soldiers fought side by side in what was inevitably an unplanned action. The skirmish in the Paris area continued throughout the greater part of 2 days. Allied tanks proved invaluable as street fighting weapons. With the last remnants of the Nazi defenders dead or captured, the Germans surrendered to the Allies on August 25th. The Nazi soldiers who had strutted around Paris with such a show of invincibility presented a far different picture. They fully realized the hate Parisians had grown to have toward them and seemed to anticipate far from gentle treatment now that the positions were reversed. The city was formally surrendered to the Allies by General Dietrich von Holtitz as commander of the Nazi garrison, which had dwindled to 12,000 men. The plan called for an Allied landing on the Mediterranean French coast between Toulon and Cannes. The whole coast coastal area, extending from the beaches inland for about 150 miles, was thoroughly softened up for the assault troops. For 3.5 months preceding the invasion date, 5,000 Allied planes dropped some 12,500 tons of bombs on southern France. Early on the morning of August 15, 1944, the mounting air bombardment was supplemented by strong naval fire against the beaches. Soon after dawn on the same morning, the invasion troops prepared for the trip to shore. There was as yet no hint of enemy resistance. Spearheaded by 3 American divisions, supplemented by French units, the U.S. 7th Army made the assault. The troops, many of them veterans of the North African and Italian campaigns, stormed ashore at 8 a.m. and met very light opposition. The landing was executed exactly as planned. The enemy was caught by surprise. The American and French assault units, once ashore, were opposed by only 2 German divisions spread along the coast and 8 more farther inland. 7th Army troops won a 15-mile-wide beachhead with comparative ease, and the operation was considered an overwhelming success by Allied field commanders. With the beachhead securely ours, the drive inland was begun without delay. The course of the advance was to be up the valley of the Rhone River. The troops started their drive toward the valley against stiffening resistance. The assault forces were helped materially by members of the French underground, as well as by French villagers encountered along the path of the advance. During the first few days of the campaign, the 7th Army and the Maquis captured more than 10,000 Nazi troops. Throughout the Allied drive in southern France, the Maquis played an especially active and extremely valuable part. The southern France invasion force was to fight its way up the Rhone Valley and then swing eastward into Germany. Having overcome the Nazi defenders along the coast, the 7th Army pushed up the valley on the heels of the main body of German forces racing north toward the German frontier. The pursuit was speeded up in an attempt to trap the fleeing Nazis. The Air Force pounded the exposed German columns steadily. At intervals, the Allied chase was slowed down, as the 7th Army troops were called upon to reduce a pocket of Nazi resistance. The GIs went about the job quickly and efficiently. During the first 2 weeks of the campaign in southern France, Thousands of Nazis were killed and 50,000 captured. After 10 days of fighting, the Allied force reached the Rhone River itself at Montélimar, 100 miles from the landing beaches. Here, a last-ditch Nazi stand was quickly beaten down. The advancing Americans trapped one Nazi panzer division and elements of two other German divisions. The Germans lost great quantities of materiel in their unsuccessful defense at Montélimar, and additional thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the brief but savage battle. In town after town in their victorious drive up the Rhone Valley, the GIs were greeted with enthusiasm by the overjoyed French townspeople. On September 11th, junction was made between the southern France assault force and American units which had entered France from the Atlantic coast. In the Dijon area, the U.S. 7th and 3rd Army troops made contact, and western France was sealed off. For the final push to the German frontier, the Allies presented a single powerful battle line. Sparking the drive to the east was Patton's 3rd Army. But the Germans did not simply fall back. The Nazis showed every intention of fighting savagely for every mile of eastern France still in their hands. They used all available mobile equipment in their strong effort to stem the Allied advance along the whole battle line. In a concerted attempt to stabilize their defense, the Nazis fought stubbornly, fully aware that if this stand were unsuccessful, the Allies would, before long, penetrate into Germany itself. In their determined defense, they used their newest, most improved weapons. The Allies hammered continuously at the Nazi line, which had stiffened abruptly. The Allied attack was not quite strong enough. Though handicapped by lengthening supply lines, the Allies kept up their attack on all sections of the front in an all-out drive toward the German frontier. The battle continued for weeks during the early autumn. Elements of Patton's 3rd Army advanced the Allied position a little closer to the German Siegfried Line as they crossed the Meuse River. All along the front, Allied planes kept up the attack on Nazi defensive positions. American troops advanced yard by yard in the drive to push the enemy back within his own borders. At Beaugency on September 17th, Nazi General Erich Elster had surrendered 20,000 German troops under his command, marking the end of the Nazi army of occupation in southern France. The mass surrender was made without the loss of a single Allied soldier's life. In the north, the Allies decided to drop 3 parachute divisions into German-held Holland in an operation ultimately designed to turn the Nazis' northern flank. The British 1st Airborne Division was to land farthest north, near Arnhem, while the Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were dropping a bit farther south. The operation was regarded as a large gamble, but if the Nazi bridges across the Rhine in the north could be seized, the war might be shortened materially. The drops were executed as planned. The first landings by the main airborne forces were made on September 17th and continued for several days following. Initial losses were slight, but there were some. In 2 weeks, more than 20,000 airborne troops had dropped into Holland. Over 13,000 more landed in gliders, which had been towed across the English Channel. But the Allied airborne troops in Holland accomplished one important task. Of the bridges to be seized, one of the most vital was the Nijmegen Bridge over the Waal, a branch of the Rhine. British and American troops surprised the Nazi force guarding the bridge and captured the valuable prize before the defenders had a chance to set off the demolitions already prepared. Allied ground forces moved safely across and continued the attack. To the south of the British forces, the Americans also ran into trouble. All along the front in the Aachen sector, as winter drew near, the fighting continued heavy. But in the Hürtgen forest, the battle was especially tough. By mid-December, the Allies had penetrated the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line at several points. American troops were crossing the German frontier in preparation for the final phase of the war in Europe. Only 6 months after the Normandy beaches had been stormed, the battle for Germany was begun.